There is a line in the duty roster of Fort Harker, dated November 14, 1864, that appears ordinary at first glance. Third watch, midnight to dawn. 2 names are listed, then crossed out. Beneath them, 2 more names, also crossed out. Beneath those, a third pair, struck through with such force the pen tore the paper. In the margin, written in a different hand, smaller, tighter, are 3 words, "None will go." By morning, the fort commander had assigned himself to the watch. He took no one with him. In his personal correspondence, sent east to his wife 3 days later, he wrote only this: "I have learned that a man may stand in the presence of something he cannot see, and know with certainty that it sees him. I have also learned that there are silences which are not empty." The fort was abandoned by December. The official report cited supply difficulties and strategic repositioning. No mention was made of the night watch, or why 17 soldiers, hardened men who had survived Shiloh and Antietam, refused a direct order rather than stand guard after dark. No mention was made of the commandant's letter, or the fact that he requested immediate transfer the morning after his lone vigil, citing reasons he would not commit to paper. But there were other letters. Letters home, letters between soldiers, letters that found their way into trunks and attics, and historical societies a century later. And in those letters, written in the careful script of men who were not given to hysteria or invention, there are details, small details, consistent details. Details about the hours between midnight and dawn at Fort Harker in the autumn of 1864, and about something that moved through those hours with a patience that was not human. This is what they recorded. This is what they would not speak of aloud. This is why, when winter came, the fort stood empty, its gates open to the Kansas wind, and no man would volunteer to retrieve the supplies left behind. Fort Harker was not a significant installation by the standards of the Civil War. Built in 1863 on the western edge of Kansas Territory, it served primarily as a supply depot and way station for troops and wagon trains moving along the Smoky Hill Trail. The fort consisted of a wooden palisade, a handful of rough-hewn buildings, and a parade ground that turned to mud with every rain. By November of 1864, it housed approximately 40 soldiers, men too injured for active combat, men awaiting reassignment, and a small contingent tasked with maintaining order among the scattered settlements nearby. The war was ending, though the men at Fort Harker could not have known that with certainty. What they knew was distance. They were 4 days' hard ride from the nearest substantial town, surrounded by rolling prairie that stretched unbroken to every horizon. In summer, the land baked under a white sky. In autumn, it turned gray and brittle, and the wind carried the smell of dust and dying grass. At night, the darkness was absolute. The fort sat on elevated ground overlooking a shallow creek, little more than a thread of water by late autumn and a line of cottonwood trees that marked its course. To the west, the land rose gradually toward distant bluffs. To the east, it flattened into emptiness. There had been a settlement nearby once, a collection of homesteads belonging to families who had tried to farm the hard earth. By 1864, most of those families were gone. Some had left for safer territory when the war began. Others had simply vanished, their cabins standing open, their fields untended. The soldiers at Fort Harker were accustomed to isolation. Many had grown up on frontier farms. They knew how to read weather, how to measure danger by the behavior of animals, how to sleep lightly and wake quickly. They were not educated men for the most part, but they were observant. They noticed when things changed. The watch rotation was a simple matter. 2 men, 4-hour shifts, 3 shifts per night. The first watch, sunset to 10. The second, 10 to 2. The third, 2 until dawn. It was dull work. The threat of attack was minimal. There had been no hostile activity in the region for months, and the nights were cold enough that standing still for 4 hours was its own kind of punishment. But it was necessary. Orders were orders. In early November, the third watch became difficult to fill. Not suddenly, not with any dramatic refusal. It happened gradually, the way a footpath becomes overgrown when people stop using it. Men began volunteering for the first and second watches with unusual frequency. When assigned to the third, they would request trades. When trades were denied, they would report to the watch ill or injured. Small injuries, a twisted ankle, a fever that broke by morning. The sergeants noticed, but there were always explanations. The cold was worse after midnight. The men were tired. Morale was low. These were not unusual problems. But by mid-November, the pattern had become unmistakable. Men who would have walked into cannon fire without hesitation were finding reasons, quiet, plausible reasons, not to stand watch in the hours before dawn. And when pressed, when questioned directly, they would not say why. They would look at the ground, or at their hands, or at some point in the middle distance, and they would offer excuses that everyone knew were lies. But the lies were spoken with such conviction, such careful sincerity, that it seemed cruel to push further. It was as if the men had agreed, without ever speaking of it, that some things were better left unacknowledged. The first mention of anything unusual appears in a letter dated November 3rd, written by Private James Lindell to his brother in Ohio. Lindell was 24, a farmer's son, not given to imagination. His letters were practical, filled with complaints about food and requests for socks. But in this letter, tucked between a paragraph about the upcoming election and a note about a sergeant's bad temper, there is this: "We have been hearing something at night. I do not know what to call it. Not an animal, I think, though it moves. It is difficult to explain. You know how you can hear a man walking even when you cannot see him, by the sound of his boots and the way he disturbs the air? This is like that, but there are no boots. Samuel says it is wind in the cottonwoods, but the cottonwoods are a quarter-mile off, and this sounds closer. Close enough that you feel you should step aside to let it pass." Samuel Routh, the man mentioned in Lindell's letter, kept a journal. It was found in 1923 among his effects after his death. The entries are brief and factual, mostly notes about weather and daily routines. But on November 5th, there is this: "Stood second watch with Lindell. He mentioned the sound again. I told him it was wind, but I have heard it myself. It begins around midnight and continues until dawn. Not constant. It comes and goes. Footsteps, but not footsteps. Movement along the palisade wall, though no one is there. We checked twice. The ground outside shows no tracks." 2 days later, another entry. "Corporal Hayes asked to be relieved from third watch. Said he was ill. He was not ill. I saw him after and he looked fine, but he would not meet my eyes. Later, I asked him what he had heard. He said he had heard nothing. But he said it too quickly." Corporal Benjamin Hayes did not keep a journal, but he wrote to his wife regularly. In a letter dated November 8th, he described the fort, the routines, the men. At the end, almost as an afterthought, he added, "There is a feeling here at night that I cannot quite name. Not danger, exactly. More like the feeling you get in a church when you are alone and the light is fading. As if you are being watched, but not by anything unkind. Just watched, measured. I do not like standing the late watch anymore. I have asked to be moved to evenings." By November 10th, 6 men had requested transfers from the third watch. By November 12th, the requests had stopped, replaced by a quieter form of resistance. Men simply would not go. They would stand at attention and accept reprimands. They would accept extra duties, reduced rations, confinement to quarters, but they would not take the third watch. Sergeant William Cobb, in a report to the fort commander, described the situation as a failure of discipline rooted in exhaustion and low morale. He recommended stricter enforcement of orders. But in his own diary, found years later in a collection donated to the Kansas State Historical Society, he wrote something different. I do not know what to make of the men. They are not cowards. I have seen them under fire. But there is something about the hours after midnight that has gotten into their heads. I stood watch myself last night to prove it was nothing. 2 to 6, alone. I wanted to show them there was no cause for fear. The first hour was quiet. Cold, but quiet. I walked the interior perimeter, checked the gates, watched the tree line. Normal. The second hour, the same. But in the third hour, sometime after 4, I heard it. Not footsteps. Not wind. Something moving along the outside of the wall. Slow. Deliberate. I called out. No answer. I climbed a firing step and looked over the palisade. Nothing. The ground was empty. The moon was bright enough to see clearly. There was nothing there. But the sound continued. It moved from the north wall to the east wall, then stopped near the gate. I could hear it there, just on the other side of the timber. Not a man. A man would make noise, breath, clothing, the shift of weight. This made no sound except the sound of its presence. I do not know how else to describe it. It was there. I knew it was there, and it knew I was listening. I did not call out again. I stood very still and waited for it to move on. It did not move. It stayed by the gate until the sky began to pale. Then it was gone, not gradually, just gone, the way a sound stops when you close a door. I will not ask the men to stand third watch again. I do not know what I heard, but I know I heard it, and I know that it was aware of me in a way that no animal is aware. It was not hunting. It was not threatening. It was simply there, patient and attentive, as if it had been waiting a very long time and could wait longer still. After Sergeant Cobb's vigil, the third watch was quietly suspended. The commander, Captain Edward Mullen, made no formal announcement. He simply adjusted the rotation so that the second watch ended at dawn, extending its hours and splitting the duty among additional men. It was irregular, but the men accepted it without question. The relief was visible. For 5 days, there were no incidents. The fort returned to its routines, drills, repairs, the preparation of supply wagons for a journey east. The mood lightened. Some of the men began to joke about the haunted hours, though the jokes were brief and uncomfortable, and no one laughed very hard. But the absence of the watch did not mean the presence had left. Men began to notice it in other ways. Private Lindell, in a letter dated November 16th. I was in the quartermaster's shed last night checking inventory. It was near midnight. I heard something outside along the back wall. That same sound, like someone walking slowly, trailing a hand along the wood. I went to the door and opened it, thinking it might be one of the men. No one was there, but I could still hear it. It had moved to the side of the building. I stepped outside and called out. The sound stopped. I walked around the shed. Nothing. But when I went back inside and closed the door, it started again. I stayed inside until it finished, whatever it was doing. It moved all the way around the building, 4 walls, slow and even, as if it were pacing off measurements. Then it stopped, and I heard nothing more. Private Amos Farrell, in a letter to his mother. We have been told not to go outside alone after dark. Captain says it is for safety, but there is no threat here. I think it is something else. Men have seen things, or heard things, or felt things. I do not know which is true. Last night I woke and thought I saw someone standing in the doorway of the barracks. Just a shape, darker than the darkness. I watched it for a long time. It did not move. I thought I was dreaming, so I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. When I opened them again, it was gone. But Corporal Hayes was awake too. I could tell by his breathing. In the morning, I asked him if he had seen anything. He said no, but he would not look at me. The sentries on the first and second watches began reporting observations. Not encounters, observations. A figure at the edge of the firelight that was not there when they approached. A shadow cast on the wall of the barracks with no source. The sense, reported by multiple men on multiple nights, of being followed when crossing the parade ground, not closely, but at a distance, as if something were mirroring their movements just beyond the range of vision. Captain Mullen, in a letter to his commanding officer dated November 18th, I am writing to request guidance on a matter of morale. The men have become uneasy after dark. There is no specific threat, but there is a persistent belief that the fort is being observed. I have conducted inspections and found no evidence of intruders. The sentries are vigilant, but their reports are vague and difficult to substantiate. I do not believe there is any real danger, but the effect on discipline is concerning. I would appreciate your recommendations. The reply, if there was one, has not survived. But Captain Mullen's personal letters to his wife tell a different story. November 19th. I do not know what to tell the men because I do not know what to tell myself. I have heard it now, the thing they will not name. It was outside my quarters last night. I could hear it moving along the wall, slow and deliberate, as if it were studying the structure. I lit a lamp and went outside. Nothing, but I could feel it. You know the feeling when you are alone in a room and you suddenly realize you are not alone? That is the closest I can come to describing it. I stood there with the lamp, looking into the darkness, and I felt seen, not threatened, just seen, known. It is a terrible feeling, Mary. I have faced many things in this war, but I have never felt anything like this. November 21st. The men will not stay here. I do not mean they are deserting. They are simply finding reasons to leave, volunteering for patrols, requesting transfers, claiming illness. I cannot blame them. I want to leave myself. This place has become intolerable, not because of any danger, but because of the waiting. That is what it feels like, as if something is waiting. Every night, it is there. Not inside the fort, but near it, circling it. I have tried to see it, but I cannot. I have tried to ignore it, but I cannot. It is patient, Mary. That is the worst part. It is so patient. November 22nd. I will stand the watch myself tonight, midnight to dawn. I have decided that whatever this is, I must face it directly. The men cannot be asked to endure what I will not endure myself. I do not know what I expect to find. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps I am succumbing to the same delusion that has gripped the others, but I must know. I will write again when it is over. There is no letter dated November 23rd. The next correspondence from Captain Mullen is dated November 26th, and it is brief. I have requested immediate transfer. I will explain when I see you. I cannot explain in writing. Please do not worry. I am unharmed. But there is another document. A single page, written in Mullen's hand, found among his private papers after his death in 1891. It is undated, but the content makes it clear that it was written on the morning of November 23rd, 1864. It was never sent. Perhaps he did not know who to send it to. Perhaps he did not want anyone to read it, but he kept it, folded in the back of a Bible, for 27 years. This is what it says. I took the watch at midnight. I told no one. I simply went to the parade ground and began the circuit. The night was clear and cold. There was no moon, but the stars were bright enough to see by. I carried a lantern but did not light it. I wanted to observe without being observed, if such a thing were possible. The first hour was uneventful. I walked slowly, stopping often to listen. I heard wind. I heard the creek. I heard nothing else. I began to think that the problem was psychological, a collective delusion born from isolation and tedium. I felt almost relieved. In the second hour, I heard the footsteps. They began near the north gate and moved slowly along the exterior of the palisade. I could track them by sound. They were deliberate, evenly spaced, neither hurrying nor hesitating. I moved to the wall and climbed the firing step. I looked over. The ground outside was empty. But the footsteps continued. They passed directly below me. I could hear them clearly. There was nothing there. I called out. I do not remember what I said. Something like, "Who's there?" or "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was profound. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of silence, if that makes any sense. I waited. I do not know how long. Minutes, perhaps. Then the footsteps resumed. They moved away from the gate, toward the east wall, then stopped again. I climbed down and crossed the parade ground to the east wall. I climbed the firing step there and looked out. Again, nothing, but I could feel it now, the presence. It was outside the wall, perhaps 10 feet away, standing in the open ground between the palisade and the tree line. I could not see it, but I knew it was there. I knew it was facing me. I lit the lantern. The light spilled out across the ground, illuminating the dry grass and the pale earth. There was nothing, but the feeling did not change. It was still there. I held the lantern higher, trying to cast the light further, and that is when I understood. It was not hiding. It was not invisible in the sense of something that cannot be seen. It was simply not the kind of thing that light can reveal. I do not know how I knew this. I just knew. In the same way you know when someone is standing behind you, even when you cannot hear or see them. I knew it was there, and I knew that it could not be seen, and I knew that it was looking at me. I stood there for a long time. I do not know why. I think I was trying to understand what it wanted, but it did not communicate. It did not move. It simply stood as it had been standing every night, waiting for something I could not comprehend. After a while, I climbed down and walked back to the center of the parade ground. I did not run. Running seemed like the wrong thing to do. I stood there with the lantern and waited to see if it would follow. It did not. I could feel it still at the wall, standing in the same place. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough for the cold to seep into my bones, long enough for the sky to begin lightening in the east, and as the darkness lifted, the presence faded. Not suddenly, but gradually, like mist burning off water. By the time the sun rose, it was gone. I have tried to find words for what I felt during those hours. Fear is too simple. I was not afraid, not in the way one fears an enemy or a predator. It was more like awe. The kind of awe one feels in the presence of something vast and incomprehensible, something that exists on a scale beyond human understanding. I do not believe it meant harm. I do not believe it meant anything. I think it was simply there as the stars are there, or the wind. And I think it has been there for a very long time, long before the fort was built, long before any of us came to this place. We happened to build our walls around a place where it walks, and now it walks through our nights, patient and indifferent, waiting for us to leave so that it can continue waiting, as it has always waited, for something we cannot imagine. Captain Mullen submitted his transfer request on November 24th. It was approved with unusual speed. By December 3rd, he had left Fort Harker. In his final report, he cited personal reasons and recommended that the fort be closed for the winter due to supply difficulties and reduced strategic value. The recommendation was accepted. The evacuation was orderly. Supplies were loaded onto wagons. Equipment was inventoried and packed. By December 10th, the last soldiers had departed. The gates were left open. There was no reason to lock them. There was nothing inside worth protecting, and no expectation that anyone would return. The official records are sparse. A few lines in the Register of Frontier Installations, noting the closure and reassignment of personnel. No mention of unusual activity. No mention of morale problems or unexplained phenomena. Just the dry language of bureaucracy. Fort closed, soldiers redeployed, matter concluded. But the unofficial records tell a different story. In the months following the evacuation, travelers along the Smoky Hill Trail began to avoid the area around Fort Harker. There was no formal warning, no posted notice. It was simply understood that the fort was a place to pass quickly, preferably during daylight. Wagon trains that had previously camped near the creek began to camp miles away, even when water was scarce. A surveyor named Thomas Grant, passing through the region in the spring of 1865, made note of the fort in his journal. "We came upon the abandoned installation in the late afternoon. The walls are intact, but the place has an unwelcoming aspect. My men refused to camp there despite the availability of shelter. When I asked why, they said only that they did not like the feel of it. I confess I felt the same. There is a heaviness to the place, a sense of something lingering. We moved on and camped 5 miles east." In 1867, a homesteader named Jacob Werner attempted to settle near the fort, intending to use the timber from the palisade for his own buildings. He abandoned the effort after 2 weeks. In a letter to his brother, he wrote, "I cannot work there. The place is wrong. I do not know how else to say it. I would wake in the night and hear something outside the tent. Every night, the same sound, like someone walking a slow circle around me. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but no animal moves like that. I left. The timber is not worth it." By 1870, the fort had been largely dismantled by scavengers, though the process took longer than it should have. Men would arrive with tools and wagons, intending to strip the site, and would leave after a day or two, taking only what they could carry quickly. One scavenger, interviewed years later by a local historian, said simply, "You couldn't pay me to stay there after dark. I don't care what anyone says. That place is watched." The site was surveyed again in 1883 as part of a regional land assessment. The surveyor's report noted that the foundations were still visible, along with remnants of the walls. It also noted, in a tone that was almost apologetic, that the area has acquired a local reputation for being unquiet at night, and laborers are difficult to hire for work in the vicinity. By the turn of the century, the fort had been almost entirely reclaimed by the prairie. The creek shifted course. The cottonwoods grew thicker. The land was leased for grazing, but cattlemen avoided it. They said the cattle would not stay there. They would drift away at night, as if driven by something the men could not see. In 1923, a historian from the Kansas State Historical Society attempted to locate the site for documentation. He found the approximate location based on old maps, but the physical evidence was minimal. In his notes, he mentioned that his guide, a local rancher, refused to approach the area after 4 in the afternoon. He said his grandfather had told him to stay away from that ground at night. Said it belonged to something that was there first. I thought it was superstition, but I will admit the place has an odd atmosphere. Very still, very quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you want to leave. There were other stories, passed down through families, shared in towns along the old trail. Stories about travelers who camped near the site and left in the middle of the night. Stories about hunters who felt followed in the hours before dawn. Stories about sounds that had no source and presences that had no form. But the stories were always vague, always secondhand. No one who claimed to have experienced something would describe it directly. They would talk around it, using words like uneasy and wrong and watched. And when pressed, they would shrug and change the subject, as if speaking too clearly about it might draw its attention. The soldiers who served at Fort Harker scattered after the war. Most returned to farms and families and ordinary lives. A few kept in touch, writing letters occasionally, attending reunions. But they did not talk about the fort. In all the correspondence that survives, in all the recorded interviews with veterans of the Western campaigns, there is not a single account of Fort Harker told aloud. The men who were there kept their silence. They had agreed, without ever needing to speak of it, that some things were better left in the past. Captain Mullen lived until 1891. He never returned to Kansas. He never spoke publicly about his service at Fort Harker. But in his papers, found after his death, There is that single page, folded in the back of a Bible. And at the bottom, in a different ink, as if added years later, there is one final line. I think it is still there. I think it will always be there. And I think it is still waiting. There are places on the prairie where the grass grows differently. Thinner, perhaps, or in patterns that do not quite follow the wind. There are places where animals will not graze, where birds do not nest, where the silence has a quality that is not peaceful but expectant. You can find these places if you know what to look for, though most people do not look. They pass by without noticing, and that is probably for the best. The site of Fort Harker is one of those places. If you were to go there now, you would find almost nothing. A depression in the earth, where the parade ground once stood. A few scattered stones that might have been part of a foundation. The creek, still running its shallow course through the cottonwoods. The land is open range, unfenced and unused. There is no marker, no sign, nothing to indicate that men once lived there, or that they left in such a hurry that they abandoned supplies they could not spare. But if you were to stand there in the late autumn, when the light is fading and the air is cold and still, you might notice something. Not a sound, exactly. Not a movement, just a quality to the silence. A sense that the space around you is not quite empty, that you are standing in a place where something else also stands, patient and observing, as it has stood for longer than anyone can remember. You would not be in danger. The thing that walks those hours does not harm. It does not threaten. It simply exists in a way that we do not fully understand, moving through the darkness with a purpose we cannot comprehend. It was there before the fort. It was there before the soldiers. It was there before the first settlers crossed the prairie. And it will be there long after the last trace of their passage has been erased by wind and time. The men who served at Fort Harker knew this, though they could not have put it into words. They knew that they had built their walls in a place that did not belong to them. They knew that the hours after midnight were not theirs to claim. And they knew, in the way that men know things that cannot be proven or explained, that the presence they felt was not something to be confronted or driven away. It was something to be acknowledged and then left alone. Captain Mullen understood this better than most. He stood in the darkness and felt the weight of something vast and indifferent, something that existed on a scale beyond human comprehension. And he understood that the only reasonable response was to leave. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. Recognition that there are places in this world that are not meant for us. Places where we are tolerated but not welcomed. Places where we will always be visitors, watched by something that was there first and will remain when we are gone. The soldiers left, the fort crumbled, the land returned to what it had been. And the thing that moved through those hours continued to move, as it had always moved, tracing its slow circles in the darkness, waiting for something that no human eye will ever see and no human mind will ever understand. In the archives of the Kansas State Historical Society, there is a box labeled Fort Harker, 1863 to 1864. It contains duty rosters, supply inventories, a handful of letters, and Captain Mullen's final reports. There is nothing unusual in any of it. Nothing that would draw the attention of a researcher or suggest that the fort was anything other than a minor installation that served its purpose and was abandoned when it was no longer needed. But if you were to look closely at the duty roster from November 14th, 1864, you would see those 3 words in the margin, written in a hand that is tight and controlled. The hand of a man who is trying very hard to remain calm. None will go. And if you were to ask what those words meant, there would be no answer. Because the men who could have answered are long dead, and they took their silence with them. All that remains is the record of their refusal, and the knowledge that they refused for a reason they would not name. The prairie is wide and empty, and the night is long. And in certain places, in certain hours, there are things that move through the darkness with a patience that is not human, and a purpose that is not knowable. They do not speak. They do not reveal themselves. They simply wait, as they have always waited, for something we cannot imagine. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it is enough to know that we are not alone in the world, even when we cannot see what accompanies us. Perhaps it is enough to know that there are mysteries we will never solve, and silences we should never break. The fort is gone. The soldiers are gone. But the hours between midnight and dawn remain. And in those hours, in that place, something still walks its slow circles, patient and watchful, as it has walked for time beyond measure. And it is still waiting,